Have you ever looked a monster in the eyes and realized he was entirely at your mercy when the ruthless Lycan King shattered a crystal goblet with his bare hands because another man smiled at his lowest-ranking maid? The entire kingdom held its breath. This is their true story. History books often gloss over the reign of Caleb Moretti, painting him merely as the brutal conqueror of the northern reaches during the late 14th century. However, recently unearthed letters from the private archives of Duchess Caroline of York reveal a much more intimate, scandalous truth about the Lycan King. The official records claim he remained unwed for political reasons, but the reality, hidden behind the towering, freezing stone walls of Winterbourne Castle, was far more dangerous. His heart and his beast had already been claimed by a woman who officially did not even exist. Her name was Rosalind Croft. In the rigid hierarchy of the Lycan packs, Omegas were rare, often fiercely protected, and married off to powerful alphas to secure bloodlines. But Rosalind was an anomaly. Born out of wedlock to a disgraced family line, she was stripped of any titles and forced into servitude to pay off her father's debts to the crown. To the rest of the castle, she was just another nameless maid in rough-spun wool, her hands calloused from scrubbing the grand hearths, her natural sweet scent of vanilla and rain suppressed daily by bathing in bitter ashweed. For 3 years she moved through the shadows of Winterbourne Castle like a ghost. But Lycan senses are impossible to fool forever. King Caleb Moretti was a terrifying figure, standing well over 6 feet, with eyes like storm clouds, and a reputation for tearing rival alphas apart with his bare hands. He ruled with absolute, uncompromising authority. The pressure on him to take a queen was mounting. The Southern Territories were threatening rebellion, and his council urged him to take Lady Isolde Harrington, a cruel, high-born alpha, from a powerful neighboring pack as his mate. Yet Caleb's inner wolf had gone completely rabid, not for power, but for the quiet Omega who cleaned the ashes from his fireplace. The obsession began weeks before the annual winter solstice gala. Rosalind had been assigned to clean the king's study. Believing the room empty, she had briefly let her guard down, her ashweed scent blocker fading. Caleb had walked in, and the moment the true, unfiltered scent of his fated mate hit his senses, the legendary Lycan King dropped to his knees. He hadn't spoken a word to her. He had simply stared, his chest heaving, his eyes flashing brilliant feral gold. Terrified, Rosalind had fled the room. Since that day, Caleb had kept his distance, bound by his duty to the kingdom, but his eyes tracked her every movement. He arranged for her duties to keep her safe, subtly altering the castle rosters so she was never given the harshest physical tasks, though she never knew it was his doing. The fragile balance shattered 3 days before the solstice gala, with the arrival of Lord Benedict Faulkner. Lord Faulkner was an alpha from the eastern shores, wealthy, arrogant, and notoriously predatory. He rode into Winterbourne with a massive retinue bringing chests of gold and spices to win Caleb's favor. But the moment Faulkner stepped into the great hall and handed his heavy fur cloak to the nearest servant, his eyes locked onto Rosalind. Despite the ashweed, Faulkner was a tracker by nature. He noticed the delicate curve of her neck, the submissive dip of her gaze, and the slight, involuntary tremble in her hands. To an arrogant alpha like Faulkner, Omegas were not people. They were prizes. "Well, well," Faulkner purred, his voice echoing in the stone corridor later that afternoon, cornering Rosalind as she carried a basket of linens. "What is a creature like you doing washing rags? You should be warming a lord's bed. Tell me your name, little bird." "I am but a maid." "My lord," Rosalind whispered, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Please excuse me." She tried to step past him, but Faulkner blocked her path, inhaling deeply. "You smell of dirt and bitter herbs, but underneath, I know what you are, an Omega, wasted in this freezing fortress. Up on the Lord's balcony, obscured by the heavy velvet drapes, King Caleb stood entirely still. Historical accounts from his personal guard note that the king gripped the solid stone balustrade so hard that the granite cracked, sending a shower of dust onto the floor below. His wolf was screaming for blood, demanding he leap over the edge and rip Faulkner's throat out for daring to breathe the same air as his mate. But Caleb was a king. To kill a visiting lord over a servant would ignite a war that would slaughter thousands of his people. Gritting his teeth until he tasted copper, Caleb forced himself to turn away, but the vow he made in the shadows that day would soon set the entire kingdom ablaze. The Winter Solstice Gala was the most extravagant event in the north. The great hall of Winterbourne Castle was transformed into a vision of opulence. Thousands of beeswax candles floated in massive iron chandeliers, casting a warm golden glow over the tapestries. The long oak tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, honey-glazed pheasant, and endless chalices of spiced blackberry mead. Every noble family from the surrounding territories was present, dressed in velvet and silk. At the center of it, all sitting at the high table on a throne of dark ironwood, was King Caleb. He wore a tunic of midnight blue, his expression carved from ice. Beside him sat Lady Isolde Harrington, draped in crimson, her hand resting far too comfortably on Caleb's arm. She laughed at the jesters whispering in his ear, playing the role of the future queen to perfection. But Caleb heard none of her words. His golden eyes were fixed on the perimeter of the room, tracking a single small figure in a plain grey dress. Rosalind had been assigned to serve wine to the lower tables. She moved with practiced invisibility, her head bowed, her steps silent. She hated the gala. The air was thick with the suffocating sense of dominant alphas, their pride and aggression, making her Omega instincts scream at her to hide. She just needed to survive the next few hours, return to the servants' quarters and lock her door. Unfortunately, Lord Benedict Faulkner had other plans. Faulkner had been drinking heavily. His face flushed his alpha aura, radiating a repulsive, heavy musk of entitlement. He had spent the entire evening watching Rosalind. When she approached his table to refill his silver goblet, he didn't wait for her to pour. Instead, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. Rosalind gasped, the heavy pitcher of wine sloshing dangerously. "My lord, please," she whispered frantically, trying to pull her arm back. His grip was like a vice, bruising her pale skin. "You've ignored me for 3 days, little bird." Faulkner slurred, standing up. He pulled her closer, his tall frame looming over her, backing her into a thick stone pillar away from the immediate light of the hearth. "I spoke to the head maid. She told me you have no family, no dowry. You belong to the castle." "I have duties to attend to," Rosalind pleaded, her voice trembling. She kept her eyes glued to his boots, knowing that making eye contact with an aggressive alpha was seen as a challenge. "Your only duty is to obey your betters," Faulkner sneered, leaning in so close she could feel the heat of his breath against her cheek. "I'm leaving tomorrow and I'm taking you with me. I've already decided. You'll ride in my carriage, and by the time we reach the eastern shores, you'll be begging to bear my mark." To emphasize his point, Faulkner reached up with his free hand, his fingers roughly grabbing her chin. He jerked her face upward, forcing her to look into his dark, predatory eyes. At the high table, the snap of King Caleb's patience was not a metaphor. It was a literal deafening crack. The heavy jewel-encrusted goblet Caleb had been holding shattered into 100 jagged pieces in his hand. Crimson wine and dark Lycan blood spilled over the polished wood of the table. The music stopped abruptly. The laughter died in the throats of the nobles. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the great hall. The sheer, suffocating pressure of an enraged King Alpha flooded the room. Weaker wolves dropped to their knees, clutching their chests as the air grew dangerously thin. Caleb slowly stood up from his throne. Lady Isolde pulled her hand back, as if burned her face pale with sudden terror. Without a word, the Lycan King descended the stone steps from the dais. His heavy boots echoed like war drums against the floorboards. The crowd parted instantly, nobles practically scrambling over each other to get out of his path. His eyes, usually a stormy grey, were now entirely unnaturally gold. His fangs were fully descended, resting against his bottom lip. Faulkner, blinded by arrogance and alcohol, finally realized what was happening. He dropped Rosalind's wrist and took a step back, suddenly looking very small as the monstrous king towered over him. "Your Majesty," Faulkner stammered, bowing deeply. "I was merely disciplining a disobedient servant." Caleb didn't look at Faulkner. He looked at Rosalind. He took in the red bruising handprint on her delicate wrist and the sheer terror swimming in her eyes. The low, rumbling growl that tore from Caleb's chest didn't sound human. It vibrated through the stones of the castle. He stepped between Rosalind and the Eastern Lord, shielding her completely with his massive frame. He leaned down his face, inches from Faulkner's sweating forehead. "Don't look at her again!" The Lycan King growled, his voice a lethal vibrating bass that made the chandeliers tremble. "If you so much as breathe in her direction, I will tear your head from your shoulders and feed your heart to the hounds." Faulkner trembled his face, entirely drained of blood. "My king, she is but a maid. She is my mate." Caleb roared the declaration, exploding through the silent hall like cannon fire. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Lady Isolde let out a shriek of outrage, dropping her glass. A king claiming a destitute servant as a fated mate was unheard of. It defied every law, every tradition, every political alliance the kingdom relied upon. Caleb turned his back on the terrified lord. He reached out his bloody, wine-stained hand, suddenly gentle as he scooped Rosalind up into his arms, right in front of the entire stunned court. She buried her face in his neck, overwhelmed by the protective pine and snow scent of the king. "You are throwing away the North for a filthy Omega." Lady Isolde screamed from the high table, her pride shattered. Caleb stopped at the archway of the hall. He turned his head, his golden eyes sweeping over the silent, terrified nobility. "The North is mine," Caleb said coldly, "and so is she. Any man or woman who questions my claim will answer to my claws." He carried her out into the dark corridors, leaving a stunned, fractured kingdom behind him. But the drama was far from over. As the doors slammed shut, a slow, malicious smile spread across Lord Benedict Faulkner's pale face. He reached into his coat, pulling out a crest he had stolen from Rosalind's chambers earlier that day, a silver crest bearing the mark of the long-lost royal house of Valerius. "She is no mere mate, Your Majesty," Faulkner whispered to the empty air, plotting his next devastating move. "She is the true heir, and I invoke the right of blood." The heavy oak doors of the king's private chambers slammed shut, cutting off the chaotic roar of the great hall. Inside, the only sounds were the crackling of the massive hearth and the ragged, shallow breathing of Rosalind Croft. King Caleb Moretti gently set her down on the edge of his four-poster bed, swathed in furs that smelled fiercely of his pine and snow scent. For a long moment, the terrifying Lycan King simply knelt before her. The monstrous, feral golden glow in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by the stormy grey she had secretly admired from afar. Carefully, as if handling spun glass, he took her bruised wrist in his massive blood-stained hands. "He hurt you!" Caleb rumbled his voice, still vibrating with residual alpha aggression. "It is nothing, Your Majesty," Rosalind whispered, trembling violently as the shock of the evening set in. You cannot do this. You have doomed your reign. The High Council will never accept a maid as your mate. Caleb pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her bruised skin, sending a jolt of pure electricity through her veins. Let them try to stop me. I have watched you scrub stones until your fingers bled, Rosalind. I have spent 3 years suffocating my own soul just to keep you safe from the politics of this wretched court. But I will hide in the shadows no longer. But while the king made his vows in the sanctuary of his chambers, a treasonous fire was being lit in the war room below. Lord Benedict Faulkner had not fled. Instead, he stood before the emergency gathering of the High Council, a coalition of powerful nobles led by Chancellor Richard Fitzroy. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the scent of fear and opportunistic greed. Faulkner dramatically threw a heavy velvet pouch onto the center table. It opened, revealing a tarnished silver crest shaped like a howling wolf entangled in briars. Gasps erupted around the table. Duke Alistair Cavendish, a staunch traditionalist, picked it up with shaking hands. This is the seal of the House of Valerius, the old bloodline. We wiped them out 50 years ago. Not all of them. Faulkner sneered, dabbing the sweat from his brow. I found this hidden beneath the floorboards of the servants' quarters. Rosalind Croft is not a peasant. She is the granddaughter of the exiled mad King Valerius. She is a royal Omega, and Caleb Moretti just claimed the last living heir to the throne he currently sits upon as his mate. The political implications were staggering. If Rosalind was a Valerius, Caleb's claim to the throne was suddenly illegitimate, unless he married her. But if he married her, he legitimized the bloodline his grandfather had slaughtered. He claims her as a mate, but the mating bite has not yet been marked. Faulkner continued, a wicked, desperate glint in his eye. He knew Caleb would kill him the moment the sun rose. His only chance of survival and ultimate power lay in ancient draconian laws. I invoke the right of blood. Silence fell over the council. The right of blood was a barbaric tradition from the dark ages of Lycan history. If an unmarried royal Omega was discovered, any alpha of noble birth could challenge the reigning claimant for her hand in a battle to the death. The winner took the Omega, and by proxy, the right to rule. Chancellor Fitzroy, seeing an opportunity to rid himself of the domineering king, Caleb slammed his fist on the table. The law is the law. We present the challenge at dawn. When the council's guards arrived at the king's chambers the next morning, they found Caleb standing guard at the door, fully armed in dark leather armor. Chancellor Fitzroy read the proclamation, detailing Rosalind's true lineage and Faulkner's challenge. Inside the room, Rosalind heard every word, the stories her mother had whispered to her, in the dark stories of a stolen crown of a silver crest she was sworn to hide at all costs, suddenly crashed down upon her. She wasn't just a maid paying off debts. She was a political prisoner kept ignorant for her own safety. Caleb's reaction was terrifyingly calm. He did not yell. He did not shift into his wolf form. He simply looked at the Chancellor with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. Faulkner signs his own death warrant, Caleb said softly. I accept. The records from the winter of 1392 show a sudden, inexplicable shift in the power dynamics of the northern reaches. Modern historians such as Dr. Evelyn Carmichael, in her 1924 comprehensive study of lycanthrope nobility, noted that the Maid's rebellion was not a war of armies, but a war of 2 wolves in a courtyard. The discovery of Rosalind's true heritage turned a scandal into a constitutional crisis. Excerpt from the archives of the York Historical Society. Before Caleb could descend to the courtyard, Rosalind rushed out, grabbing his arm. "Caleb, no falconer is a coward. He will not fight fairly. He is from the eastern shores. They use alchemy and poisons. Let me flee. If I am gone, the challenge is void." Caleb stopped, reaching out to cup her face. "If you run, you will be hunted for the rest of your life. You are a queen by blood, Rosalind. It is time you stop hiding in the ashes." The central courtyard of Winterbourne Castle was a circular arena of hard-packed snow and towering granite walls. The entire court had gathered on the balconies, their breaths pluming in the freezing morning air. The atmosphere was charged with a sickening mixture of dread and bloodlust. Lord Benedict Faulkner stood at the far end of the courtyard. He had stripped off his heavy velvet coats, wearing only a reinforced leather tunic. In his hands, he wielded two curved eastern blades. But to the trained eye, something was deeply wrong. Faulkner's veins pulsed with a sickening, glowing purple hue. He had ingested a concentrated derivative of nightshade and alpha-stimulant, a lethal cocktail that would eventually kill him, but for the next hour granted him the strength of 10 men and immunity to pain. He also carried a secret weapon. The blades of his swords were coated in a fine, clear, sap-refined wolfsbane. King Caleb stepped out onto the snow, drawing his massive, double-edged broadsword. He refused to shift into his wolf form, a deliberate insult to Faulkner, signaling he intended to butcher the Lord as a man. Up on the highest balcony, guarded by 4 of Caleb's most loyal knights, Rosalind watched. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer wearing the rough-spun wool of a maid. The king's tailors had hastily draped her in a heavy cloak of black fur and silver silk, the colours of House Moretti. "Let the rite of blood commence," Chancellor Fitzroy shouted from the parapets. Faulkner didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward with unnatural, terrifying speed. The clash of steel rang out like a thunderclap. Caleb parried the first blow, the sheer force of it cracking the ice beneath his boots. He immediately sensed the unnatural strength in the Eastern Lord. Faulkner fought like a rabid dog, unleashing a flurry of wild, devastating strikes. Caleb remained purely defensive, letting Faulkner exhaust himself. With a calculated sidestep, Caleb swung his broadsword, aiming to cleave Faulkner in two. But Faulkner was unnaturally fast. He twisted mid-air, taking the glancing blow to his shoulder without even flinching. As Caleb recovered from the heavy swing, Faulkner thrust his curved blade forward, slicing a deep, jagged gash across Caleb's ribcage. Caleb grunted, stepping back. Instantly, the skin around the wound began to blister and turn black. The scent of burning flesh and bitter chemicals filled the cold air. "Wolfsbane!" someone screamed from the crowd. Lady Isolde Harrington, watching from the sidelines, smiled wickedly. The poison worked, instantly flooding Caleb's nervous system. His vision blurred, and a low, pained snarl ripped from his throat. His knees buckled, and he dropped to one knee, leaning heavily on his sword. The poison was actively suppressing his Lycan healing factor, paralyzing his muscles. Faulkner laughed, a manic, breathless sound. "You see, Your Majesty, the old blood always falls to the new. She will be mine, and your kingdom will burn." He raised his blades for the killing blow. On the balcony, Rosalind's terror shattered. The submission drilled into her for years evaporated in a single blazing instant. She saw the man who had protected her from the shadows, the monster who had shown her nothing but reverence, about to be slaughtered because of her. She gripped the stone railing and unleashed the one weapon an Omega possessed. Closing her eyes, Rosalind stopped fighting her nature. She released the mental barriers she had built over a lifetime, flooding the courtyard with her true, unfiltered scent. It was not just the sweet smell of vanilla and rain. It was the ancient, commanding aura of a royal Omega, a scent so powerful, so intoxicatingly dominant in its own right, that it forced every alpha in the courtyard to their knees in involuntary submission. The scent hit Caleb like a bolt of lightning. It bypassed the poison. It bypassed the pain. The primal bond of the fated mate, combined with the royal decree of her pheromones, triggered an ancient, catastrophic reaction within the king's biology. Faulkner swung his swords down. They never connected. With a roar that shattered the glass in the surrounding windows, Caleb caught both of the poisoned blades in his bare hands. Blood poured from his palms, but the king didn't care. His eyes were no longer stormy grey or even gold. They were a glowing, terrifying crimson. His muscles expanded, his jaw elongating as he underwent a partial, monstrous shift. Before Faulkner could comprehend what was happening, Caleb twisted his wrists, shattering the steel blades into fragments. Faulkner stumbled back, the artificial courage of the stimulants evaporating in the face of a true apex predator. "No, wait, Mercy." "You forfeited mercy when you looked at her," Caleb growled in a voice made of grinding stone. Caleb surged forward, dropping his broadsword. He grabbed Faulkner by the throat with one massive clawed hand, lifting the struggling lord entirely off the ground. The crowd watched in absolute horrified silence as Caleb's grip tightened. With one brutal, sickening twist, the rite of blood was concluded. Caleb tossed the lifeless body of Lord Benedict Faulkner into the snow. The king stood alone in the center of the courtyard, his chest heaving, dark blood staining his hands and tunic. He looked up at the balcony. The Chancellor and the High Council were trembling, realizing they had just backed a traitor against a king who was practically a god among wolves. "The challenge is won," Caleb roared to the silent castle. "Does any other man wish to claim my mate? Does any other lord wish to challenge her throne?" Not a single soul moved. Caleb marched toward the stairs, ignoring the burning poison in his side. He ascended to the highest balcony, the guards parting for him instantly. He stopped in front of Rosalind. She reached out her trembling fingers, gently tracing the hard line of his jaw. The crimson faded from his eyes, returning to the soft grey she loved. In front of the High Council, in front of Lady Isolde, and in front of the entire northern kingdom, the towering Lycan King dropped to one knee, bowing his head to the former maid. "My queen," Caleb whispered, loud enough for history to hear. "Dr. Evelyn Carmichael's notes in the York archives state that the reign of King Caleb and Queen Rosalind Moretti was the longest and most prosperous in Lycan history. They united the fractured Pax, not through fear, but through an unbreakable bond that survived poison politics and war. Rosalind never scrubbed another hearth, and King Caleb personally ensured that no Omega was ever treated as property again. The crystal goblet Caleb shattered on the night of the winter solstice gala was never replaced. Its fragments were carefully gathered by the queen herself, melted down and forged into the very crown she wore until her dying day, a constant reminder that sometimes the greatest empires are built not on battlefields, but in the ashes. If you were captivated by this true medieval werewolf romance and the epic rise of the Omega Queen, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this video with fellow fantasy lovers and subscribe to the channel with notifications on so you never miss a deep dive into the hidden dramatic histories of the Lycan lore.